Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romance stories, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story. The smell of death was a permanent resident in the wind that swept across Silas's land. It clung to the bare branches of the cottonwoods lining the creek and whispered through the dead grasses of the Wyoming plains. It was the ghost of the 100 head of cattle he'd lost to the great blizzard, a storm that had descended like a white wolf, silent and then suddenly savage, burying his future under 10 feet of unrelenting snow. Now, with the spring thaw revealing the grim tally of his losses, another kind of predator was circling. Frank. Silas dismounted in front of Frank's imposing 2-story ranch house, a monument to profit built on the misfortunes of others. The wood was freshly painted, the windows gleamed, and the porch was wide enough to host a barn dance. It was an insult to the grit and dust that defined life out here. He tied his weary horse, a mare with ribs showing like the hoops on a barrel, and took a deep breath of the clean, cold air, trying to purge the scent of his own failure before facing the man who reveled in it. His boots, worn thin at the soles, made a hollow sound on the polished porch steps. Inside, Frank's office was suffocating. Thick cigar smoke hung in the air, mingling with the scent of whiskey and oiled leather. A fire roared in a stone fireplace, casting a flickering, predatory light on the taxidermied head of a great grizzly bear mounted on the wall, its glass eyes forever fixed in a silent snarl. Frank sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a fortress of wood between him and the world. He was a portly man, his vest straining at the buttons, his bald head gleaming with sweat despite the room's oppressive heat. He didn't rise. He simply gestured with his cigar to the leather chair opposite him. "Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble of contentment. "I was expecting you." Silas didn't take the offered seat. He remained standing, his tall frame rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His face, weathered by sun and worry, was a mask of grim determination, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, betrayed the desperation clawing at his insides. "You know why I'm here, Frank. The loan. I need an extension. The blizzard. It wiped me out. But the spring calves are coming. If you give me until the fall roundup." Frank let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound like rocks grinding together. He took a long, leisurely pull from his cigar, blowing a perfect smoke ring that drifted toward the ceiling and dissolved. "An extension? Hope is a fine breakfast, Silas, but a poor supper. I've seen your land. I've seen the carcasses the wolves are getting fat on. You don't have a herd anymore, you have a boneyard. You won't recover by fall. You won't recover by next fall." Each word was a hammer blow, cracking the thin veneer of Silas's pride. He knew it was true. The numbers were a brutal, unforgiving language he'd been reciting to himself every sleepless night. "My father built that ranch from nothing," Silas said, his voice low and raw. "He broke that soil with his own hands. It's all I have." "Was," Frank corrected, tapping the ash from his cigar into a crystal tray. "It was all you had. Now it's security on a debt you can't pay. The deed is mine, free and clear, by the end of the week." He leaned forward, his small, shrewd eyes glinting. "However, I am a man of creative solutions. An opportunity has presented itself, one that could benefit us both." Silas's jaw tightened. He knew better than to trust any opportunity Frank presented. It would have a price, and that price would be paid in flesh and soul. "I'm listening," Frank smiled, a slow reptilian stretching of his lips. "You know the widow, the one on the adjacent property, the old Callaway place." Silas's stomach twisted. He knew of her. Everyone in the county did. Myrtle, the burned widow, a recluse who hadn't been seen properly in years, not since the fire that took her husband and, according to the whispers, half her face. They said she was a monster, a bitter crone who dwelled in shadows, her spirit as scarred as her body. "What about her?" "That land is prime," Frank continued, ignoring the question. "Good water, sheltered from the north wind. It should be part of my holdings. It connects my northern pasture to the river. But the woman, she refuses to sell. Sent my men packing with a shotgun last I inquired." He took a swig of whiskey from a glass on his desk. "She is, however, a woman alone, unprotected, a creature of pity. It would be a Christian act for a man to take her under his care." A cold dread, colder than the heart of the blizzard, began to seep into Silas's bones. He saw the shape of the trap before Frank had finished building it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Frank said, setting his glass down with a decisive click, "that you are going to marry her." The air left Silas's lungs. The roaring fire seemed to dim. The grizzly on the wall seemed to sneer. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. Marry her? Precisely. You will marry the widow Myrtle. You will live on her land. You will be her husband. And in return for this service, he said, savoring the word, I will consider your debt paid in full. I will tear up the note. You can keep your father's boneyard for all the good it will do you. Silas stared, speechless. The proposal was grotesque, a violation of sense and decency. Marry that phantom, tie himself to a disfigured recluse, a woman spoken of in hushed, pitying tones, live out his days as a nursemaid to a monster, all while Frank effectively controlled the land through him. It was a life sentence, a prison of flesh. You're insane, Silas finally managed to say. I'm a businessman, Frank countered smoothly. Once you're her husband, you'll convince her to see things my way, to sell, or should she meet with an unfortunate accident, well, as her grieving widower, the property would be yours to do with as you please. It's a clean solution. The casual cruelty of it, the unveiled threat against the woman's life, sent a wave of revulsion through Silas. But the alternative was the cold, hard fact of losing everything. The ranch wasn't just land and cattle. It was his name, his history, the sweat of his ancestors soaked into the soil. It was the only thing he had left to honor their memory. To walk away from it would be to let them die a second death. He thought of the long, empty years ahead, a life without the hope of love, of a family of his own, a life tethered to a specter. He would be sacrificing himself, his future, his happiness, for a piece of dirt and a legacy of ghosts. But the alternative was to have nothing at all. I'll need to see her first, Silas rasped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Frank's smile widened. He had won. An excellent idea. A man should see the horse before he buys it. I've already arranged it. She's expecting a visitor. The ride to the Calloway place was a journey into a deeper circle of hell. Silas's mind was a maelstrom of shame and resentment. He was being sold like a stud horse, and he was letting it happen. The cabin, when he reached it, was even more forlorn than the stories suggested. It was small and weathered, hunkered down against a rise as if trying to hide from the sky. The windows were grimy, and the porch sagged, a place of deep and abiding sorrow. He knocked, and after a long silence, the door creaked open just a few inches. A figure stood in the shadows of the interior, completely shrouded in a heavy, dark grey shawl that covered her from head to ankle. Another layer, a thick black veil, obscured her face entirely. She was shorter than he'd imagined and seemed hunched, as if carrying an immense weight. "Myrtle?" Silas asked, his voice rough. A low, raspy sound came from behind the veil. "What do you want?" The voice was brittle, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Frank sent me. About a proposal." There was another long silence. The veiled head tilted slightly. "Come in!" The inside of the cabin was clean but stark, filled with the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke. The air was still and heavy. She glided to a chair by the cold hearth, her movements slow and deliberate, and sat without a word, a lump of grey wool in the dim light. Silas stood awkwardly by the door, his hat in his hands. He felt like an intruder in a tomb. "Frank explained the arrangement," he said bluntly, wanting to get it over with. "He did," she rasped. "He wants my land. He thinks you can get it for him." "And you're agreeing to this?" Silas asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "What choice does a woman like me have?" The words were flat, devoid of emotion, yet they carried the weight of utter despair. As she spoke, she shifted, and the veil moved with her. For a single horrifying second, the light from the grimy window caught the side of her face. Silas saw it, a patch of skin below her cheekbone that was not skin at all, but a swirl of dark purplish tissue, puckered and raised like the crater of a burn. It seemed to pull her mouth into a permanent, gruesome grimace. Silas flinched, an involuntary recoil that he couldn't suppress. He felt his stomach churn with a mixture of pity and revulsion. The stories were true. They hadn't even done her justice. The veiled head snapped back as if he had struck her. She saw his reaction. She must have seen it 1,000 times. "Get out," she whispered, the rasp in her voice now sharp with a pain that cut deeper than any fire. Silas turned and fled. He stumbled out into the clean air, gulping it down, trying to erase the image seared into his mind. He had his answer. He knew what his sacrifice entailed. He leaned against the rough wood of the cabin wall, his eyes closed, the Wyoming sky vast and empty above him. The deal was struck. His freedom was the price. And he was filled with a cold, bottomless dread for the wedding night that was to come. The wedding was not a celebration. It was a transaction, officiated by a bored justice of the peace, whose stained collar and whiskey-sour breath spoke of a man who had seen too many miserable beginnings. The ceremony took place in a dusty, wood-paneled room at the courthouse, a space that smelled of old paper and regret. Silas stood stiff as a fence post in his cleanest threadbare suit, his gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster wall. Beside him, Myrtle was a silent, hunched shape, a scarecrow wrapped in mourning cloth. Her face remained hidden behind the thick veil, and she offered no responses beyond a barely audible rasp when prompted. The only other witness was Frank, leaning against the doorframe with a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. He looked like a wolf watching two lambs being led into his own private pen. The justice mumbled the final words. The ink was barely dry on the certificate, and it was over. Silas was a married man, shackled not by love, but by debt and deception. Frank clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of ownership, not congratulations. "The deed to your father's land will be on your doorstep by morning," he said, his voice a low, proprietary growl. "Enjoy your wedding night." The sneer in his tone made it clear he imagined it would be anything but enjoyable. The ride back to the Callaway, no, his wife's cabin, was a study in silence. The rattling of the wagon wheels and the plodding of Silas's mare were the only sounds punctuating the vast, indifferent landscape. The woman beside him did not speak, did not move, did not seem to even breathe. Silas felt a suffocating weight press down on him. Every mile marker was a nail in the coffin of his future. He was riding toward a prison of his own making, and the spectre he had bound himself to was his warden. He looked at her, this shrouded lump of misery, and a bitter, acidic resentment churned in his gut. He had traded his life for dirt and bones, and now he had to share his bed with a ghost. When they arrived, the cabin seemed even more desolate than before. It was their home now. The word felt like a curse. He unhitched the horse and led it to the ramshackle barn, taking his time, delaying the inevitable. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a beautiful, mocking farewell to the last day of his freedom. When he could delay no longer, he walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy with dread, and pushed open the door. Myrtle was standing by the hearth, her back to him, still wrapped in her funereal layers. Faye's single lantern cast a weak golden light, throwing long dancing shadows across the room. A plate of cold bread and dried meat sat on the small table, an offering neither of them had the stomach for. "I'll sleep in the barn," Silas said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. From within the shawls, the raspy voice answered, "No." It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. A husband does not sleep in the barn, not on the first night. Frank has eyes everywhere. People will talk. The deal will be undone if it is not seen to be real. She was right, of course. Frank would have someone watching, ensuring his puppet was playing his part. The humiliation was absolute. He had to perform this charade, this grotesque pantomime of a marriage. He poured a generous measure of whiskey from a flask in his coat, the fiery liquid doing little to burn away the cold dread in his soul. He drank it down in one gulp, the burn, a welcome distraction. "Fine," he ground out. "But I'm not—" "The bed is yours." "The bed is ours," she corrected, her voice still a low, grating whisper. "Go. The bedroom is through there. I will be in shortly." Resigned, Silas moved toward the only other door in the cabin. He felt like a man walking to the gallows. The bedroom was small and Spartan, containing little more than a sturdy wooden bed frame with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a small curtainless window that looked out onto the darkening plains. He sat on the edge of the mattress, which groaned under his weight, and buried his face in his hands. He thought of his father, of the sacrifices made for the ranch. Was this honor, or the ultimate disgrace? To be bought and sold, to be forced into the bed of a woman whose very appearance made his skin crawl. He heard her slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the door and braced himself, his entire body tense with revulsion and grim duty. The door creaked open. He didn't look up. He heard the rustle of heavy cloth, the soft thud of her shawl falling to the floor. He heard the faint splash of water in the basin on the washstand. He waited, his jaw clenched, for the hunched, disfigured creature to join him. But the silence stretched. Finally a voice spoke, and it sent a jolt through him, a lightning strike to the very core of his being. "You can look at me now, Silas." The voice was not the dry, rasping whisper of a broken crone. It was clear, melodic, and laced with an unmistakable note of defiance. It was the voice of a young woman. Slowly, hesitantly, Silas raised his head, and the world tilted on its axis. The woman standing by the washstand was not Myrtle, the burned widow, not the monster from his nightmares. The moonlight streamed through the small window, bathing her in a silver glow. She had shed the heavy, shapeless garments and now wore a simple, clean nightgown. Her figure was slender but strong, her posture straight and proud. Her hair, unbound, was a cascade of rich chestnut-brown waves that fell past her shoulders. But it was her face that stole his breath. It was a face of stunning, unconventional beauty, with high cheekbones, a determined chin, and a full, expressive mouth. And the skin was flawless, smooth, pale, and utterly unmarred. The grotesque, puckered scar, the hideous disfigurement that had turned his stomach, was gone, vanished, as if it had never been. Staring back at him were two of the most striking eyes he had ever seen, the vibrant, fierce green of new spring leaves after a long winter. They held no fear, no pity, only a challenging, intelligent light. Silas shot to his feet, his mind reeling, unable to process what he was seeing. He stared, speechless, his mouth agape. Who are you?" he stammered. "Where is she? Where is Myrtle?" A small, wry smile touched her lips. "I am Myrtle." She picked up a damp cloth from the washstand and wiped a final, dark smudge from her jawline. "And the woman you met before? The woman you married this afternoon? She was also me." Silas felt the floor drop out from under him. He took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, I saw you. The scar, it was—" "Ash," she said simply, her green eyes never leaving his. "Soot from the hearth, mixed with crushed elderberry juice for color and a little lard to make it stick and shine. It's amazing what people will believe when they're expecting to see a monster." She gestured to the pile of discarded shawls and the veil on the floor. "A stooped shoulder, a rasp in the throat, a thick veil, and a county full of gossips does the rest of the work for you." He was utterly dumbfounded, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Rage warred with astonishment. The sacrifice he had agonized over, the life sentence he had accepted with such bitter resentment, it was all based on a lie, a theatrical performance. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why would you do this?" Myrtle walked to the window, her silhouette framed by the moonlit plains. "My husband Jacob was a good man, but he was too trusting. When he died in the fire, I was alone, a young widow with prime land and a good well. I knew what would happen. Men like Frank would circle. They wouldn't see a grieving woman, they'd see an opportunity, a weak thing to be cheated, or coerced, or worse." She turned back to face him, her expression hardening. "So I gave them something else to see. I let the stories about the fire grow. I helped them along. I created a monster, because men might try to prey on a helpless widow, Silas, but they leave a hideous, bitter monster alone. It was a shield. It was the only way I could protect myself, the only way I could keep my home." Silas stood there, frozen, the entire foundation of his reality shattered and rearranged in the span of a few minutes. He had married a phantom, only to find a flesh-and-blood woman of shocking beauty and even more shocking cunning. The resentment he had harbored for her, for his fate, was now a confusing jumble of anger at the deception and a powerful, undeniable wave of awe. He had been played for a fool, but the woman who had done it was no mere trickster. She was a survivor, a warrior who had used the world's prejudice and fear as her armor. The marriage he had dreaded as a bitter end suddenly felt like a terrifying, bewildering, and utterly captivating beginning. The dawn broke cold and sharp, spilling pale light across the floor of the small cabin. Silas had not slept. He had spent the night in a chair by the cold hearth, staring into the embers, his mind a battlefield. Across the room, Myrtle had taken the bed, a silent presence in the dark. The revelation of her secret had left him unmoored, adrift on a sea of confusion. The pity he'd felt was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. The revulsion had vanished, supplanted by an unnerving and deeply inconvenient attraction. But overshadowing it all was a simmering anger. He had been manipulated, his desperation used as a pawn in her own game of survival. He rose as the first birds began their chorus, his joints stiff, his head aching. He found Myrtle already awake, stoking the fire in the cook-stove. She moved with an easy, practical grace that was jarringly different from the feeble hunch of the creature she had pretended to be. She wore a simple, homespun dress and had her rich chestnut hair tied back in a sensible braid. She looked less like a mysterious widow and more like a homesteader's wife, ready for a day of hard work. She glanced at him as he entered, her green eyes wary. The defiant fire from the night before was banked, replaced by a cautious uncertainty. She didn't know this man she had married, this stranger who now held a claim to her life, if not her land. "There's coffee," she said, her voice the clear, melodic tone that still felt like a phantom limb in his hearing. He grunted an affirmative, pouring a cup of the black, bitter liquid. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, a fragile truce held together by the strangeness of their situation. They were husband and wife in name, strangers in truth, bound by a lie. "So what now?" Silas finally asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You've kept your land. I've saved mine. We continue this charade." "It is no charade to Frank," she replied, her gaze fixed on the flames in the stove. "He believes you are married to a disfigured recluse. He believes he owns you, and through you, he believes he will own this ranch. He will not stop until he does. The only thing that has changed is that now you know the truth." "The truth is you deceived me," he shot back, the anger bubbling to the surface. "You let me believe I was sacrificing my entire life, my future, for nothing but a pile of dirt." She turned to face him fully, and the fire in her eyes flared to life again. "Did you not agree to marry a monster to save that same pile of dirt? Your sacrifice, as you call it, was a business transaction. You traded a wife you found repulsive for a deed. Do not pretend you came to this arrangement with noble intentions, Silas. We both did what we had to do to survive. The only difference is my reasons were not just about land. They were about my life." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Because they were true, he had made his own bitter bargain. He had looked at her with disgust, and seen only an obstacle, a price to be paid. He had not seen a person at all. The realization was a bitter pill, and his anger receded, leaving a hollow space of shame in its wake. He took his coffee and went outside, needing the vast open space of the plains to breathe. The sun was climbing, illuminating the land she had fought so hard to protect. It was good land. He could see that now, with a rancher's eye. The grass was rich, the creek ran clear, and the small valley was sheltered. It was a place worth fighting for, and the woman inside, the woman who had crafted such an elaborate deception, was clearly a fighter. That day, a new, unspoken rhythm began. They started the hard work of running the ranch, not as husband and wife, but as wary partners in a fragile alliance. He was a cattleman, and his expertise was needed. She had a small but healthy herd that had survived the blizzard in the shelter of the valley. Silas rode out, assessing the stock, his movements sure and practiced. He found a section of fence that had been brought down by the snow, and he set about mending it. The familiar physical labor a welcome balm to his turbulent mind. He expected her to remain in the cabin, tending to domestic chores. Instead, she emerged an hour later, wearing sturdy boots and carrying a pair of worn leather gloves. She worked alongside him, her movements efficient and strong. She knew how to stretch wire, how to set a post, how to handle the tools, with an expertise that surprised him. "Jacob taught me," she said, answering his unasked question as they worked. "He always said the ranch was a partnership, that I needed to know how to do everything he did in case anything happened." A shadow of old grief passed over her features, a genuine sorrow that was more real than any of her play acting. As the days turned into a week, Silas discovered more of the real Myrtle. She was not just beautiful and cunning, she was fiercely intelligent. She knew the land intimately, every gully and game trail. She knew the patterns of the weather and the language of the birds. Much of this knowledge, she explained, came not just from her late husband but from his closest friend, a Lakota warrior named Kahana. "Kahana's people have lived in these hills for generations," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, a respectable distance between them. "He and Jacob were like brothers. He taught us which plants could heal, how to read the signs of a coming storm, how to live with the land instead of just on it." Silas, who had been raised with the typical settler's distrust of the native tribes, found himself listening with a grudging curiosity. Her connection to this Lakota man was another unexpected layer to the woman he had married. Their fragile alliance was tested a few days later when a young calf fell ill with scours. Silas, having seen it happen 100 times, was grim. The usual outcome was death. He was prepared to put the creature out of its misery. "No, wait," Myrtle insisted. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a poultice of herbs that smelled of sage and willow bark. She spent hours with the calf, gently forcing a tea she had brewed down its throat and speaking to it in a low, soothing voice. Silas watched from a distance, skeptical. But by the next morning, the calf was standing on shaky legs, and by evening, it was nursing from its mother. He was stunned. "Kohana's remedy," was all she said. In that moment, watching her gentle, capable hands on the small animal, something shifted in Silas. The last vestiges of his resentment began to crumble, replaced by a deep and unsettling admiration. This woman was a force of nature, a survivor who had turned her grief into strength, her fear into a weapon. Their newfound peace, however, was not destined to last. Frank had been patient, but his patience was wearing thin. One morning, Silas rode out to find a section of their newly mended fence cut and 20 head of cattle missing. There were tracks deliberately churned to hide the number of riders, leading east toward Frank's vast holdings. The message was clear. Silas rode back to the cabin, his face a thundercloud of fury. "It's Frank," he said, swinging down from his horse. "He's rustling our cattle. It's a warning. He's reminding me who's in charge." Myrtle came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was grim, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a cold resolve. "He thinks he can pressure you. He thinks the helpless, ugly wife will be of no consequence." "He's wrong," Silas said, the words coming out with a ferocity that surprised even him. A few weeks ago, he would have felt trapped, a pawn in Frank's game. Now, looking at Myrtle at the ranch they were building together, he felt a hot, protective instinct flare within him. They had stolen his cattle, their cattle. "We need to get them back," Myrtle said, her voice steady. "It's too dangerous," he countered. "He'll have men waiting. And you think he'll stop at 20. This is just the beginning, Silas. He will bleed us dry a few head at a time until we have nothing left. He will break you, and then he will come for me." She looked out at the vast plains, her gaze distant. "I will send word to Kohana. He watches the herds. He will know where they've taken them. We are not alone in this fight." Silas looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not the ghost he had been forced to marry, nor the beautiful stranger who had shocked him on their wedding night. He saw a partner, a woman of iron will and deep courage. They were bound by a common enemy, their shared struggle forging a bond far stronger than any fraudulent marriage certificate. "All right," he said, his decision made. "We fight." The warning came not with the thunder of hooves, but with the whisper of a shadow detaching itself from the twilight. Silas was checking the latch on the barn door when a young Lakota boy, no older than 15, seemed to materialize from the dusk beside him. The boy's face was serene, but his dark eyes were urgent. He spoke in his native tongue, a language Silas didn't understand, but Myrtle, who had appeared on the cabin porch as if summoned by the same silent signal, listened intently. She replied in a few quiet Lakota phrases, and the boy nodded once before melting back into the growing darkness. "What is it?" Silas asked, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "It is as we feared," Myrtle said, her voice a low, steady current in the charged air. "Frank is done playing games. He's gathered a dozen hired guns. They ride tonight. He means to burn us out, kill who he has to, and take this valley by force." A cold knot of fear tightened in Silas's gut, but it was immediately burned away by a hot surge of protective fury. This was his home now. This was her home. He would not let Frank take it. "A dozen men against the two of us. We are not just two," she said, and for the first time he saw the glint of a warrior in her green eyes, a reflection of the ally she trusted. "And we have something Frank's men don't. We have the land, and the land fights for us." There was no time for panic. The hours that followed were a blur of focused, desperate energy. This was not a battle to be won with bullets alone. It was a battle of wits. Guided by Myrtle's encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain, they worked not to build a fortress, but to turn the ranch itself into a weapon. They didn't have dynamite or barricades, so they used what the valley gave them. In the narrow, rocky draw that formed the only direct approach to the cabin, Silas spent an hour loosening boulders on the high ridge, creating a small, precarious rock slide that could be triggered by a single, well-aimed rifle shot. Further down, where the trail passed through a thicket of aspens, Myrtle strung thin, nearly invisible tripwires made from gut fishing line. They weren't attached to explosives, but to cowbells and clusters of tin cans that would raise a racket, turning the element of surprise against the attackers. Their most ingenious trap was at the creek crossing. Working together in the moonlight, they hauled buckets of slick, wet clay from the creek bed and painstakingly coated the smooth, flat stones on the far bank, creating a treacherous, invisible patch of grease. As they worked side by side, A silent understanding flowed between them. Every shared task, every quick affirmative nod wove their fragile alliance into a bond of tempered steel. He saw her not as a damsel to be protected, but as a brilliant strategist, a commander of her own territory. She, in turn, saw him not as a resentful jailer, but as a steadfast guardian, his strength now fully committed to their shared cause. They finished just before midnight, retreating to the dark cabin. They extinguished the lanterns, plunging the home into shadow. Silas took up a position by the front window with his Winchester rifle, while Myrtle stood near the back door, a double-barreled shotgun held with practiced ease. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the plains pressed in, every cricket's chirp, every rustle of the wind sounding like the approach of doom. They came near 2 in the morning, a dark mass of riders moving with arrogant confidence. They were loud, already tasting victory. The first sign of trouble for them was the cacophony of bells and cans erupting from the aspen thicket. The sudden jarring noise threw the horses into a panic. Shouts and curses echoed in the night as riders fought to control their spooked mounts. Frank's voice cut through the chaos. "It's nothing. Get moving. Spread out and circle the cabin." His men, now dismounted and unnerved, advanced on foot. The first group tried to cross the creek. The slick clay did its work. Cries of surprise and pain rang out as men slipped, their feet flying out from under them, sending them crashing onto the hard stones or splashing into the cold water. Their rifles were fouled with mud, their confidence shattered. From the cabin window, Silas watched the chaos unfold. He wasn't aiming to kill, but to control. He fired the Winchester, not at the men, but at the loose rocks on the ridge above the draw. The shot echoed like a cannon blast, and with a deep groan the rockslide gave way. A river of stone and dirt cascaded down, blocking the main approach completely, trapping half of Frank's men on the wrong side. Frank, now enraged, rallied the few men who had made it across the creek. "Forget the horses, burn it, burn the whole damn place down," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. But as his thugs advanced on the cabin with torches, another presence made itself known. On the ridge overlooking the valley, silhouetted against the moon, a line of riders appeared. They were silent, motionless figures on horseback, each holding a lance or a bow. It was Kohana and a dozen Lakota warriors. They didn't charge. They didn't shout a war cry. They simply sat their horses, a silent, powerful jury passing judgment. The sight broke the hired gun's nerve completely. They had signed on to bully a lone rancher and a reclusive widow, not to face the legendary wrath of Lakota warriors defending their friends. One by one, they dropped their torches and their guns, raising their hands in surrender. Frank stood alone, his face purple with rage and disbelief, his plan in ashes around him. He saw Silas step out onto the porch, Winchester held ready. In a final, desperate act, Frank drew his pistol and leveled it, but he was too slow, his movements clumsy with fury. Silas was faster, calmer. He didn't fire. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from Frank's hand with the barrel of his rifle and sending the larger man sprawling into the dirt. It was over. The arrival of the territorial marshal the next day was a formality. Faced with a dozen captured and talkative witnesses and the stoic, damning testimony of Kohana, Frank's power in the region was broken for good. He was led away in chains, his final hate-filled glare at Silas and Myrtle promising a revenge he would never be able to enact. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun rose on their second day as true partners, Kohana approached the porch. He looked at Myrtle, a deep, familial respect in his eyes. Then he turned his gaze to Silas. He said nothing, but his nod was a clear acknowledgement. He saw not the man who had been forced into this arrangement, but the man who had chosen to stand and fight for it. He saw a husband. When they were finally alone, Silas and Myrtle stood together, looking out at the land they had saved. The air was clean, washed by the night's violence, and smelled of dew and fresh earth. The valley was theirs, truly theirs. The coercion, the secrets, the resentment, it had all been burned away in the crucible of the fight, leaving only the pure, unvarnished truth of who they were. Silas turned to her, his heart full of a feeling so powerful it left him breathless. It was more than admiration, more than respect. It was a deep, resonant love for this incredible woman who had hidden her light not out of weakness, but as a brilliant act of strength. "Myrtle," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was losing my life. I was wrong, I was just beginning it." She looked up at him, and in her beautiful green eyes, he saw the walls, she had so carefully built around her heart finally coming down. A soft, genuine smile, the first he had ever truly seen, graced her lips. "We began it together, Silas." He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her face. It was not the face of a monster or a stranger, but the face of his wife, his partner, his home. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was not part of a bargain or a charade, but a solemn, freely chosen vow. It was a kiss that sealed not the end of a bitter contract, but the true beginning of their life, a life they would now build side by side in the heart of the valley they had fought for and won. True strength is often hidden behind a carefully constructed shield, and the deepest bonds are not found in convenience, but forged in the fires of shared struggle. Never judge a person by the scars they show, but by the courage with which they bear them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.